The 14th century began like any other in medieval Europe. Peasants woke before dawn to work fields they did not own. Lords collected taxes from people who would never escape poverty. The church bells rang across villages and cities alike, marking the hours of a life that seemed eternal and unchanging. But this century would not be like the others. The 1300s would become the darkest period in European history, a time when death itself seemed to walk among the living, when faith was shattered, when the very foundations of society crumbled into dust. This is the story of how Europe survived its darkest age. To understand the catastrophe that was coming, we must first understand how people lived before it arrived. Medieval Europe was a world built on a rigid hierarchy. At the top sat kings and queens, ruling by what they claimed was divine right. Below them, the nobility controlled vast estates of land. Below the nobility, the clergy held spiritual power over every soul. And at the bottom, making up more than 90% of the population, were the peasants. These were the people who grew the food, built the buildings, and did the work that kept society functioning. In return, they received almost nothing. A typical peasant in the early 1300s lived in a small wooden hut with a dirt floor. The entire family often shared a single room with their animals. There was no glass in the windows, just wooden shutters to keep out the cold. In winter, temperatures inside the home were barely warmer than outside. Smoke from the cooking fire filled the room because chimneys were rare. People slept on straw mattresses crawling with insects. They wore the same rough wool clothing for months without washing it. Bathing was infrequent, and the smell of human bodies mixed with animal waste was simply part of daily life. The diet of a medieval peasant was monotonous and barely sufficient. Dark bread made from rye or barley was the staple food. Vegetables like cabbage, onions, and turnips provided some variety. Meat was a luxury that most peasants tasted only a few times per year, usually during religious festivals. Water was often contaminated, so people drank weak ale instead, even children. Malnutrition was common, and most peasants were shorter and weaker than their noble counterparts who ate better. A bad harvest meant hunger. 2 bad harvests in a row meant famine. And famine came. The early 1300s brought a series of disasters that weakened Europe before the greater catastrophe arrived. In 1315, it began to rain across northern Europe. It rained through spring. It rained through summer. It rained through fall. The crops rotted in the fields. The following year, the rain continued. For 7 years, the weather remained cold and wet. Harvests failed repeatedly across England, France, Germany, and the Low Countries. This period became known as the Great Famine. The effects were devastating. Food prices rose to 10 times their normal levels. People ate anything they could find. They ate dogs, cats, and rats. They ate tree bark and grass. There were reports of parents abandoning children they could no longer feed. There were whispers of darker things, of people eating the flesh of the dead, of murder for food. Historians estimate that 10 to 15% of the population of Northern Europe died during the Great Famine. Cities saw hundreds of bodies collected from the streets each day. The dead were buried in mass graves without ceremony. The famine finally ended in the early 1320s, but Europe had been permanently weakened. The population was smaller, sicker, and more vulnerable than before. The generation that survived the famine would soon face something far worse. Something was stirring in the distant east, in the trading posts along the Silk Road, in the ports of the Black Sea. Merchants returning from these distant lands brought back not just silk and spices, but also stories of a terrible plague that was killing entire cities. Most Europeans ignored these rumors. The East was far away, and such stories always seemed exaggerated. They had no idea that death was already on its way. The Black Death arrived in Europe in October of 1347. 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the port of Messina in Sicily after a journey through the Black Sea. The people who gathered at the docks to greet the ships found something horrifying. Most of the sailors on board were dead. Those still alive were covered in strange black swellings that oozed blood and pus. The swellings appeared in the groin, the armpits, and the neck. The 6 sailors were burning with fever, vomiting, and delirious with pain. Within days, they were all dead. The authorities ordered the ships out of the harbor, but it was already too late. The plague had arrived. The disease spread with terrifying speed. Within weeks, Messina was devastated. Within months, the plague had spread to the Italian mainland. By the following year, it had reached France, Spain, and England. No one understood how the disease spread. Some thought it was carried by bad air, by the smell of decay and corruption. Others believed it was a punishment from God for humanity's sins. Some blamed Jews, foreigners, or beggars. None of these explanations was correct. The true cause was a bacterium carried by fleas that lived on rats. But medieval people had no concept of bacteria or germs. They only knew that death was everywhere and that nothing could stop it. The symptoms of the Black Death were horrifying. First came fever and chills. Then the swellings appeared, growing to the size of eggs or apples. These were called buboes, which gave the disease its medical name, bubonic plague. The buboes turned black as the tissue died, hence the name Black Death. Victims also developed dark spots across their skin as internal bleeding spread beneath the surface. Some coughed blood, indicating the plague had reached their lungs. This pneumonic form of the plague was even more deadly and spread directly from person to person through the air. Most victims died within 3 to 5 days of showing symptoms. The mortality rate was between 60 and 90%. There was no treatment. There was no cure. There was only death. The social fabric of Europe began to tear apart. Doctors refused to see patients. Priests refused to give last rites. Parents abandoned sick children. Children fled from dying parents. The bonds of family, community, and faith that held society together dissolved in the face of overwhelming fear. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence, wrote that brother abandoned brother, uncle abandoned nephew, sister abandoned brother, and very often wife abandoned husband. Fathers and mothers refused to see and tend their children as if they had not been theirs. The dead piled up faster than they could be buried. In the early days of the outbreak, people still tried to give proper Christian burials to the victims. But as deaths mounted into the hundreds and then thousands per day, this became impossible. Mass graves were dug outside city walls. Bodies were dumped into rivers. Corpses lay rotting in homes for days because there was no one left alive to remove them. The smell of death hung over cities like a fog. Contemporary accounts describe carts rolling through streets as workers called for people to bring out their dead. Some people responded to the plague with prayer and penance. Groups of flagellants traveled from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public displays of devotion. They believed that by punishing their own flesh, they could appease an angry God and end the plague. These processions drew huge crowds at first, but the flagellants also spread the disease wherever they went. Others responded with hedonism, reasoning that if death was coming anyway, they might as well enjoy whatever pleasures remained. Boccaccio wrote of people who believed that the sure cure for plague was to drink and be merry, to sing and make jokes, to satisfy every appetite, and to laugh at everything. The plague did not discriminate by class or status. Kings and peasants died alike. The King of Castile, Alfonso XI, died of plague. The daughter of King Edward III of England died on her way to her wedding in Spain. Archbishops, bishops, and priests died in enormous numbers, creating a crisis in the church that would have lasting consequences. Entire monasteries were wiped out. In some areas, there were not enough priests left alive to perform services or hear confessions. The church, which had promised salvation and protection, seemed powerless against this invisible enemy. By 1350, the first wave of the Black Death had swept across most of Europe. The devastation was almost incomprehensible. Historians estimate that between 30 and 60% of the European population died in just 4 years. Some regions lost even more. Parts of Italy and southern France may have lost 70 or 80% of their inhabitants. England's population fell from around 6 million to perhaps 2 million. Cities that had been home to tens of thousands now held only a few hundred survivors. The world that emerged from the plague was fundamentally different from the world that had existed before. The massive death toll transformed European society in ways that no one could have predicted. The old feudal system began to break down. With so many peasants dead, those who survived suddenly had bargaining power they had never possessed before. Landowners desperately needed workers to farm their fields. Peasants could now demand higher wages, better conditions, or simply leave one lord and work for another who offered better terms. In England, the government tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels through the Statute of Laborers. This attempt to preserve the old order failed and only increased resentment among the working poor. The church also faced a crisis of authority. People had prayed for deliverance from the plague, and their prayers had seemingly gone unanswered. Priests and monks had died just as readily as anyone else, despite their supposed holiness. The mass deaths of clergy left many positions unfilled, and the replacements were often poorly trained and less devout. Corruption in the church became more visible and more resented. The seeds of the Protestant Reformation, still over a century away, were planted in the spiritual devastation of the Black Death. But the plague was not finished with Europe. It returned again and again over the following decades. A second major outbreak struck in 1361. A third came in 1369. Each new wave killed more of those who had survived before. Children born after the first plague had no immunity and died in large numbers. It would take Europe nearly 200 years to recover its pre-plague population levels. Some historians argue that the population of England did not return to its 1300 level until the 18th century. The cultural impact of the Black Death was profound. Death became an obsession in art and literature. Paintings depicted the dance of death, showing skeletons leading people from all walks of life to their graves. The message was clear. Death comes for everyone, rich and poor, young and old, holy and sinful. Nothing you do in this life can protect you from the end that awaits us all. This dark vision reflected the trauma of a generation that had watched the world die around them. Yet from this devastation, the seeds of a new world were being planted. The old certainties had been shattered. The feudal system that had dominated Europe for centuries was crumbling. The church's authority was weakened. People began to question traditions that had seemed eternal. In the chaos and transformation that followed the plague, new ideas could take root. Some historians see the Black Death as a crucial turning point that ultimately led to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the modern world. The death of the old order created space for something new to be born. The 14th century ended as it had begun, with a Europe still struggling to recover from catastrophe. The plague would continue to return periodically for centuries. But the worst was over. The survivors and their descendants would rebuild. They would create new art, new ideas, new ways of organizing society. They would eventually send ships across oceans to discover new continents. The seeds of the modern world were planted in the mass graves of the Black Death. Perhaps that is the strangest legacy of the 1400s. Out of the greatest catastrophe Europe had ever known came the transformation that would ultimately create the world we live in today.